All right, everybody, how you doing? Good. My name's Josh Lynch, and today we're going to be looking at making cloth and painted metal in Infinite Warfare. So let's go ahead and get started. So the agenda real quick today is going to be, first of all, I want to say thanks to Infinity Ward for letting me discuss Call of Duty Infinite Warfare and the materials I made for the project. And for this session, we will be discussing creating materials for Call of Duty Infinite Warfare, why and how Substance Designer was used, and some general material creation strategies. And then at the end, I'm going to be opening up Substance Designer and doing a breakdown of two materials. And then at the end, I'll open up the floor for like a wrap-up and Q&A kind of thing. So any questions you have, just let me know. And even if we run out of time on the booth, I'll be around. You can come up and talk to me. That's what this is for. So just let me know. And then these are the two materials we'll be doing a breakdown of. So this cloth padded wall here on the left, and then the painted metal flooring on the right. So some of the benefits of working with Substance Designer are its speed and usability. So when working on Call of Duty, we wanted to get a lot of materials into the game quickly. So we just really made really rough and quick passes of things and just got it into game. We didn't spend too much time making it final. We just wanted to see if it worked. And then if it did, we took it further. And if we didn't, we just threw it out. No big deal. So it's highly iterative and completely non-destructive. So I love that aspect of it. Like I just mentioned, we could get things in there quickly, but once we have something made, you know, when the lead or the art director or even your fellow artists come by, you want to make a change, it's really easy to do it. So we can get great results with out-of-the-box nodes. I'm a big fan of that. The reason is, I think a lot of people get intimidated by effects maps, and I do. So I tend to just use the out-of-the-box stuff, and I think it works pretty good. And then there's an unparalleled amount of reuse, so if you wanted to make your own custom nodes, or if you wanted to just take a set of nodes from one file and bring it to the other, just all works really well. And then we have consistency across multiple materials and multiple levels, right? So you want your materials to all look cohesive, but you all want the levels they go in to feel really good as well and look like they're of the same DNA. And then we have a clean creation process, so we clean height and normal maps are generated first and inform the rest of the material. So what I mean by that is, I'm a big fan of making the height and normal first, and then you use that data to leverage information for your gloss and your albedo later on. And then there's no more lack of noise control or fighting baked in lighting information from photo sourcing. And then the albedo is authored without any lighting information. So not only do you not have to fight it anymore if you were using a photo source process, but you don't have to worry about it ever being added in, because you wouldn't do it. All right, so here's some basic art direction notes for Infinite Warfare. So we wanted to create a grounded world. So this meant no typical sci-fi tropes. Everything would have a push to feel realistic in its construction. And I mentioned visual DNA and cohesion just a bit ago, but to me, the gamers should feel like they are in a unique and curated world, right? You don't want it to feel like, I don't know, you want it to feel special, like they paid good money to see something and you're passionate about what you're doing, so take the time to make it feel good. And the materials should all feel like they belong together, share a similar DNA, and they should sit well in the scene together. Nothing should feel jarring or out of place. So for example, you wouldn't see, it seems obvious, but like a cobblestone wouldn't fit on a spaceship, right? So just be mindful of that kind of stuff. And then here's some specific notes that are pertinent to today's talk. So the Retribution ship interior and world art notes. So there was a big effort for giving the world an indication of layering or depth via world geo and supporting materials. So if you look at this reference image on the right, it feels like there's different layers to it, right? Like there's ribbing on the the interior of the plane, and then the floor panels feel like they're well constructed, but you could get in there and get behind them. So for materials, this meant that even if you couldn't see behind it, it should look like there are layers behind it or could be opened up. And the cloth and painted metal floor that we're going over today were heavily influenced by this. So here's a shot of the Retribution interior. So if I just kind of go back and forth, you can see there's a lot of similarities to how that feels, right? Like this panel on the left the gray like wall support structure, there's an indication that there's support behind it, and then the flooring looks like you could take it out if it got really damaged and then put a new one in. And there's like little cubbies down here. There's like an open airflow gap. And then again, we use materials to give that feeling that like there's something behind it. So we popped off this panel, looked like there's some pipes underneath. Here's another shot kind of showing that same direction, right? And the flooring's here. You got some ribbing on the side and it's hollow underneath. All right, so considerations when authoring materials for Infinite Warfare. So Call of Duty is an action-packed game, right? It's that's what it's good at, right? It's a blockbuster type game. You know what you're getting into when you play it. So for most the maps, players are running around and there's a lot of action. So there's not a lot of pausing and looking around. It's not like a third-person kind of narrative game. You want the materials to kind of just feel good as you're running around. So the interior of the Retribution was an exception to this rule. It was one of the few places in the game where you could kind of take your time and go through it slowly. So what does this mean? You want your materials to have clean reads and be easily identifiable at a glance. So like I just mentioned, you're running around, you want it to feel like, hey, that looks like a wood panel, this looks like cobblestone, that feels like plaster. And then detailed gloss maps. So we paid a lot of attention to the gloss. You want a really good feeling when the light rolls across the surface, and that's what makes materials feel alive. Is like, does it feel smudgy and scratched up, or is it clean? And everything you get a sensation of that is derived from your gloss or your roughness. And then there's eye rest. So we had simple albedos, and I could take a note of there's beauty and restraint. So if I jump back a slide here, you can see that everything in here, like the albedos are relatively simple. And to me, that makes it feel good when you look into the shot. It's not jarring and it's not noisy. You could just look around and find new things. And if you notice the flooring, there's a lot of attention paid to the gloss map. And then where it's out of the light, the colors are really simple. All right, so we made simple yet flexible materials. Like the materials were fairly simple and they didn't have a lot of layering built into them. So that meant, you know, like if there was like a cobblestone ground, for example, we didn't layer in mud and a ton of pebbles. We depended on blends to give that effect. So this meant that they could be used in a variety of levels and scenarios, and they were often used with decals and blends later to add detail and layering. And one thing we wanted to do when authoring these textures is to maximize potential. So it's advantageous to try to build textures that can have multiple purposes and use cases. So the ability to use on a floor, wall, or ceiling when appropriate. So I threw up this trim sheet as an example. Like, this could be found in any of those places, and you want it to be flexible enough to be used as such. All right, so I get a lot of questions about when I'm at work, like how does it shake out? So I have this slide from task assignment to final pass. So the first thing that I do or is done is reference gathering. So you gather as much reference as you can, because ideas can come from all over the place. And then we have planning, and create a plan of attack based on gathering reference and just your discussion with your lead. And then you test it in game, as I mentioned earlier. You want to get it in early and often, and you want to not work in a vacuum. Like, you want to talk to your coworkers, make sure that things are working. You don't want to just spend 4 days on something and it looks really good, but it's not going to work for the map. Communication, you talk with your other artists, and most importantly, be open to feedback and having to iterate. All right, so here's inspiration from real world reference. A lot of time was spent looking at real world and military reference when creating art assets for the Call of Duty universe. Creating materials is no exception. Every material that is made is based on or inspired by real life reference. Each material is grounded in physically accurate material properties. So here's a kind of an image collage of a bunch of stuff that I was inspired by for the cloth padded materials that we did. All right, so I wanted to go over how I think about breaking down reference, because I get this question a lot as well. So here's a padded wall from an interior of a plane. So I try to think of things from like a macro to micro. So I try to identify details of all sizes. So if I'm looking at this image, the thing that I notice is there's large panels with indications of the panels being connected. Undulation in the surface, there's a diamond pattern with metal fasteners, and then there's subtle surface noise. I know this image is like shrunk down, but on the high res you could see it. And then as far as the gloss and roughness, it's mostly uniform light response with pops from the stickers and the metal fasteners. And crevices show breakup of light. And then in the albedo, it's simple dark value with subtle discoloration and pops from the stickers. All right, and so this is how I think about height and normal. Like I mentioned earlier, you want to create these first. They're the foundations of any material, and a strong foundation is key. And without these maps, the albedo and the gloss roughness are not going to shine. You don't make the normal map too intense. Everything will look dark and self-shadowed. So I'm sure you guys are familiar with, there's the ZBrush normal map matte cap, right, that comes with it, and then there's the one that you download that you should use. So that's kind of what I'm trying to say, is like you don't want it to be like solid pink and purple and green. You want it to be there but subtle. Like you don't want it to be really harsh looking, because in the game it's going to look like self-shadowed and darkened. I'll go over that when we open up Substance. I'll give an example of that. So as far as the strategies go for gloss and roughness, it controls the light response on the surface. Smooth surfaces have tight highlights that reflect the world around it, and matte surfaces have a broad highlight with little reflection of the world around it. I can't stress this enough. It's a good idea to establish basic material separation and properties early on to start to give the material some life. And you want a good amount of detail in your gloss and roughness map. You don't want to like skimp out on this. Like this is what's going to make the material feel good when the light rolls across the surface. And then depending on the surface type, in my opinion, this map is arguably as important, if not more, than the normal map. Okay, and then as far as the albedo goes, you want simple albedos. They provide the best result. Using simple colors as a base is ideal. And you want to keep colors in line with reference material. Don't bake lighting information into the albedo. Trust the shader and trust the lighting. They're going to do their job. And then I take a moment to mention that quality albedos can take time to create in Substance Designer. There is no one node to make your albedo look great. It's like there's no magic noise combination that you can plug into a gradient map. It takes more effort than that. And the way I work is Photoshop workflows and apply inside of Substance Designer, and that's how I still work. So to me, that means effective layering and decision making to create believability and improve the overall quality. So like, you start with base colors, then you add your detail, right? So that's kind of the same way I work inside of Substance. And then I use a lot of masks generated from curvature and AO maps to create believable details. All right, so as far as the ambient occlusion, this is essential for selling depth in a material, but every game engine's different, right? So you might have this loaded up as its own map, or it might be packed into a channel. And some engines, you just don't get an AO slot for whatever reason. It could be budget or whatever. But if you don't have one, one thing that I've done in the past is use the ambient occlusion as a mask to add dust and dirt into the albedo to fake depth. That way you're not baking light into the albedo, but you're giving a sense of depth via dust and dirt collecting. So you're going to get a similar effect, but it's a naturally occurring thing for dust and dirt to collect into the crevices. So to me, there's some key ways to make surfaces feel alive. So I talk about bending the light. To me, that means adding slope to the normal map, and that will make the surface feel organic by bending the light. So if you notice here, like in this slice on the cobblestone, each stone feels like it's kind of tilting. And then there's the fingernail test. So when I'm working on something, I try to think of like, how does it look if how would it feel if I scrape my fingernail across it? Like, is it smooth? Am I going to scrape it and I'm going to scratch up my nail? I feel like when you look at your normal map, you should be able to get that sensation, and if you can achieve that, then you're doing a good job. And then there's the tail of the light. You want to treat the gloss with good amount of attention, because it's going to bring interest when the light hits the surface. And then I've said it multiple times already, but simple albedos, and it keeps eye rest when the light is not hitting the surface. So you want your albedo to have enough attention in it to where if it's in the ambient lighting, it's like in the shadow, it feels good, but you don't want it busy enough to where when the light rolls across it, it's going to be like kind of doubled up. So if the albedo is really busy and then your gloss has a lot of interest in it, it's going to look like really noisy. You don't want that. You want to have one be simple and one be kind of detailed. All right, so let's go ahead and get into Substance Designer. And thanks for taking the time, and I hope it was informative. And we're going to go over the material breakdowns for the padded wall and the metal floor, and then afterwards, like I mentioned, we'll do a QA. So just, have your questions ready and we'll answer them. All right, cool. So the first thing I want to go over is this metal floor surface here. Let me double check something. Okay. So for this material in particular, it had already been created in the game in Endu, right? And so they wanted an updated pass on it. So what I did was I created a material ID map, and then I brought in the normal map, and then I went ahead and added details on top of that information in Substance Designer. So as far as the material ID map goes, it's something like this. I'm sure you've seen these before. It's just a way to isolate detail and create masks, right? So I use this color to mask. So let me just go ahead and do it from scratch so you guys can kind of see what's happening here. So if I double click this, I can bring up the color, and I single click the color to mask. And there we go. So there's the little eyedropper, right? So it's going to allow me to pick anywhere. So I could pick inside of the UI here, or I can pick from this color map. So I'm going to go ahead and hit pick, and I'm going to grab red. And it would help if I connect it first. Sorry. So I've got my material ID map. I'm picking this red spot, and I get this mask. So this whole chain setup here is just that over and over and over again. Okay, so it's not like it's a bunch of nodes in one spot, but it allows me to get a really good amount of material separation for my work later on. So I took the time to do that first, and then I brought in my normal map. Okay, so let's look at what I did to layer on details. So if you look at this normal map, the one that was made in Endu, everything is very smooth, right? But surfaces in real life aren't smooth. Like any painted metal surface, especially the industrial kind that we were going for, they have bumps on it. Nothing is perfectly smooth, right? So, so I have this, the first thing I went ahead and did was I made this chipped paint pass. And honestly, like you could take this and you could tuck it away into one node and you could run your normal map into it and then have the output come out, but I wanted to show you guys how it works. So I basically get curvature set up, right? So I have curvature smooth, curvature, and I run through this. So I'm able to get these really harsh white, black lines. I use the levels to clamp it down, and then I blur it. I'm just going to run through this really quick, so because there's a lot of stuff to cover. Then I run it through levels. I use this as a mask to cut out this black strip here, this kind of like rubber strip. Okay, so I take the time to isolate these details. Then I run it through a series. I won't go through each one, I'll just go through one. But I use a slope blur. So I get this noise, do it again. Histogram scan, I'm like clamping it up, right? I'm making it really harsh. Then I use this this data here, and I subtract it. So I'm taking the really like uniform data, and then I'm breaking it up, okay? And then I use a histogram range to clamp that down. So I go from this to this, and that gives me this like really nice organic breakup. So like this area is really chipped up, but nothing's happening here, and then it's heavy down here, that kind of thing. And then, so at the end, I do a few different setups for this. So then at the end I end up with this, and this is my like chip paint mask, okay? So that's the first thing I did. And then I mentioned like having subtle amount of noise in the chip paint, right? So I always start off with this base color, like a flat color, because I think of it about everything like it's flat gray. Like if I was in Maya, I have a plane, or if I'm in ZBrush and I need to go up or down, I'm going to go to white or to black. But I try to think about it in terms of realistic depth. So I don't make everything go from pure white to pure black, because it's a floor. It's not going to be that deep. So I just try to think about it that way, and that kind of helps me stay focused. And everybody works differently, but that helps me. So I take this kind of noise right here, just like a little stipple, and then I do like a subtract. And you can't even see it in the height, but in the normal it shows up. So if I kind of get in here, you can see that like little stipple, and that just makes things feel realistic, like it's not just perfectly smooth. And then I wanted to take the time to put like these types of scratches into the painted metal, right? Like not everything is just in the color or in the gloss. There's actual gouges that happen. So I took a scratch generator, I blurred it just a little bit, and then I use a grunge, and I subtract it, and that gives me like a nice breakup. And then I subtract out where the black rubber line would be, because I only want it to be on the painted metal panels. And then I just run that in, and again, you can barely see it, but it's in here. Like if I move the light around, you can see those gouges, right? So this is kind of what I'm talking about. If I take a minute to focus right here, if I have the light off the surface, it's very simple looking. But if I spin the light around, there's a lot of interest happening, right? It's coming from the gloss mainly, but it's also coming a bit from the normal matte. So I have these subtle dents. It's just noise. I blurred it, and then I'm just dropping it down in here. And I do a multiply. So let me grab this here. Get a normal. And a levels. We do Bengio, something like 12. I'm going to grab my alpha, and I'm going to crank that up. So I'm removing the alpha. So if you look here, you can see that this is where we're at. So this surface is starting to feel like there's some divots in it, and there's some interest, right? You want it to feel like it's heavily trafficked. So then I do some subtle carving. I'm just going to kind of drag this along. And this is another kind of scratches. So I take these like this line data, and then I do a histogram scan, and I do a warp. So I kind of give a skewing to it, and then I do a directional warp, and then that kind of breaks it up for me. So if we look at this here, you can see I'm getting some additional scratches. So I wanted some of them to go like crossways, and then I wanted some to feel like it was dragged in one direction, just so it had more of a narrative. And then I have these swirly lines. They do the same thing. It's a bunch of carving. So I take these kind of crisscross lines. I use a warp to swirl them around. I blur it, and I do a levels. And that's where this kind of stuff's coming in, right here. And then this is my chipped paint mask, and I use that as a subtract very subtly. So if we look right here, there's like a pixel depth change, so it feels like the paint has some thickness to it. And then another thing I talked about in the PowerPoint was giving the surface, you want it to have some tilt. So these panels are pretty straight, but even if you look at like glass windows, nothing is perfectly straight. There's some subtle tilting. So what I did was I took this gradient, I isolated it to the larger panels, and I just converted that to a normal. So you could see this one's darker purple, this is darker blue, so they're all going to give some shift when the light hits it. and then I just overlay that in a normal blend, so you can see they're all one hue, and then now this shifts. So this is blue, this is purple. So if you look at the light, as it rolls across, this is like really catching a lot of the light, and this is not reflecting it, and that's because there's that tilt there. So if I were to take this out, you can see that the light really continues across the surface, and as soon as I add that back in, it fractures it, right? And you want to be careful with this. Like sometimes if you have this going along in a tile, it can get really repetitive, but in the cases where we were using it, it was just in corridors, so it added enough depth and it was good. All right, so I want to talk about the gloss next. So again, I mentioned starting off with just large blocks of color, and every one of these blend nodes has this setup where it's like a color, uniform color, and then I'm plugging this mask in. So I rely on that quite a bit. So that's solid colors. So as you can see, I hope you guys can see that all right. As I step through, each one of these sections is kind of getting a unique looking feel. All right, so I'm starting to make things pop and feel different from each other. So maybe one of these panels is newer than the other, right? So it's shinier looking, and the other one's matte because it's older. Just want to take the time to sell that narrative. And then this is the chipped paint mask. So I make that relatively glossy. And one thing that I tried to do was the bevel of the normal map is pretty thin, but if you think about chipped paint, if something's hitting it, it's going to hit at the surface and then fade out, and nothing goes completely down into the crevice. So that's why this kind of fades off a bit. And then I have this grunge. So like I mentioned, all this interest here is pretty important. So if I take this from this point, and I just do like a levels, just to drag it over, and I connect this, you can see that like it's pretty boring looking, right? There's nothing going on. So that's where we start to add that interest in. All right, so excuse me. There's a couple ways I do my grunges. So sometimes I'll take like these existing grunge maps and I'll just mess around with the sliders until I get something like this, and I just add in, layer it up, and then I use noises to break things up. And then I just have this transform 2D in here because I wanted to rotate it so then it looks like the grunge was happening like along, like if you were looking at it from this perspective and you're going down the path, it looks like over time things were just drug across the surface a bunch. So if I remove this, it goes horizontal and you lose that narrative of like a directionality. And then I use a directional warp to shift this data around. So what I'm going for here is if I remove this, you can see it here. It starts to, I try to avoid anything that looks like, I took like a grunge overlay in Photoshop and I just overlaid it. I want to give each section a kind of a unique feel. So maybe this panel has more grunge on it and this other one has less. So it feels organic as the light's rolling across. And this here is like some of the scuffs, and I'll go over that in more detail. You can see it better in the color. And then that's just calling more attention to the rubber. And so there's these scratches here, right? So you'll see that, like previously I had like a scratches generator, but this one I'm using a tile sampler with a crescent. I went over it yesterday, but I'll just kind of go over it again real quick. So if I grab a tile sampler, and I have all these squares, right? If I change it to crescent, then I go to pattern specific, I drag it up, and then I take the X size and I drag it down, and I take my scale up. You can see that I'm getting these thin lines, like these really thin lines, but what I like about it is in the center, they're the strongest, and then at the ends they fade out. So that gives a natural looking, like there's a contact, it goes down, and then it came back up. So I tend to use that quite a bit. So I have my scratches, I run it through a histogram scan, I blur it, I use a warp just to give it a subtle bend. Not everything's perfectly straight. And then again, I use another directional warp fed by this multi-value grayscale map, and it scatters it around. And then I isolate all the details to just the painted metal. And then those are used as a subtract to make it more darker, which makes it look matte. And then I just add more grunge in here. Then I use the levels to like clamp it down, because I really wanted it to feel really crunchy and like old. That's the gloss pass. And then for the color, it's a similar thing. I start off with really basic blocks of color. So as I'm stepping through, you can see everything is kind of pulled apart. What's going to be metal is black. And if you look, like I mentioned the idea of like these panels being replaced over time. So like, you know how it is, like if you have a wall in an apartment and they painted it like 10 years ago and they did a fresh coat because somebody had damage, that new coat is going to look slightly different, right? So I wanted this one to have a slightly different hue. It kind of makes it feel more organic. And then I try to do like a subtle noise in here. And it just really breaks up the surface. It makes it like not one flat color. And then these are like the scuff marks right here. This is the chipped paint. And then I have an edge dust, right? So I try to, even though you sometimes can barely tell, you want to have that information in there. So that's what it looks like. It's just anything to make it feel like it's lived in, right? So then I have this like swirly dirt. So basically what I have here is like a vertical noise. And I just use a transform 2D to skew it. I did a histogram scan. I did a directional warp to give it like a swirly look. And then another warp to break it up even more. And then I isolate it per panel. And then I throw a grunge on to break it up. So that's in there pretty subtly. So if we take a moment to look at it in terms of value, there's not a lot of shift from one section to the other. The rubber is darker, but the painted metal is all relatively even, and there's nothing that really goes very bright. And if there were stickers in here, I feel like that would be a bit different, but I guess what I'm trying to say is it's okay for it to feel, you want some contrast, but it doesn't always need to be like this jump from dark to light. Because if you have that everywhere, then in the scene it's going to be like jumping all over the place. So it's okay to, like I said before, there's some beauty and restraint, and you just want to let the lighting and the shader and the rest of the scene do the work. You just want the texture to contribute to the overall composition. You don't want it to be the showcase. All right. So yeah, that's pretty much it for the painted metal floor. I'm going to go over the cloth padded wall material. Let me see. Let's get these to load up here. All right. So I mentioned working from macro to micro, like big to small. So the first thing I do is I identify these vertical panels. And I do it with a tile sampler. So what I'm after here is I'm after multi-value grayscale data, and I really try to leverage that in the beginning. I feel like if you can get a hold of anything that gives you this data, you're set for the rest of your material. So that allows me to shift like data around like grunges or noises or anything like that, like I mentioned in the previous file, but it also allows me to go in and do like an edge detect, right? So as I'm going through, I also am keeping in mind, like, as I'm working, I have like the major panels here, but then I'm also mindful of these vertical bars and horizontal bars. So I have this set up, and then I'm subtracting this out from the horizontal bar, and I give it a little blur. And then I use, again, I start off with like a flat gray, and then I use that this data here to do a screen. So I'm subtly lifting up the padded wall, and then I have a diamond set up. So again, it's just this, like this shape ran through a tile sampler. Then I use the directional warp to give each panel a unique pattern. And I also like this kind of stuff because, especially with fabric, like if you look, where the edge transitions are, it looks like it was cut out, right? It looks like as they were working and they cut this, it ended there, and it not everything has this like perfectly, like the diamond is not perfectly cut off at the edge, and that gives it a more organic looking construction. So then it's just this type of stuff where I do an edge detect, I run it through levels, I blur it, and then I'm doing a screen. And I do that a couple times. So this one is like an initial raise up, and then the next raise is this one, but then I use like a clamp it down, and then I use the multi-value grayscale data to do a multiply, so they're not all raised up uniformly. So it's all these subtle things, like as you're building it up, it just gives a more natural feeling in the end. So you can see that some spots on the height map are brighter than others. And then I do a fine noise, and that just makes it feel like a nice looking fabric. Here, let me do this here. All right, let me go a little brighter here. So we're just looking at it. You can see that there's like a subtle stipple. So it depends on the way your stuff looks in game, but this type of fine detail, you really want to check it in the game to see if the noise is even there. So you could argue that this may not look fine enough and small enough in here, but in our game it looked fine, so that's what I went with. Again, I'm not trying to work in a vacuum, I'm trying to go for what looks good in the scene and adapt to that. All right. So as far as these vertical bars, one thing I like to do is I'll take my height map setup, I'll get a mask from the vertical bars, and I'll blur the data incoming. So that kind of flattens everything out, okay? So it's basically like going into ZBrush and taking a smooth brush and you're just like, or like a planer, and you're just like, okay, this is all flat. So I'm prepping it for something to come in, and then for the next part, I raise it up. And I have like a subtle blur on the edge, but I'm some lift, right? And then I have this set up here where I get like a channel, because I was talking, like in the reference, there's the fastening, right? So the idea was I wanted to give these panels like a feeling of construction, that they were put together. And so visually, even though you can't just go up to it and like pull it open, it looks like if you were to like get in there and you could pull these panels apart, that's kind of the look I was going for. And so I do an overlay. So I'm raising and lowering there, and then I'm really syncing it back with this one. And then this part here is like, I call it an edge ramp, but basically I wanted where the panels met at the edge, I wanted a feeling of tension and like compression there to feel like they're pulled back and then the center's kind of coming up. So I have this mask, then I run a distance node, I blur it, and then I just cut out that channel line and I do a subtract. So basically I'm pulling in everywhere except for where the vertical and horizontal bars are. And then I give them their own type of noise, the vertical bars anyway. So if we look at it, they have a slightly different feeling than the diamond pattern. And then as far as the metal fasteners go, they're just like I could have set this up probably a more efficient way, but this is what I did at the time. And so I just wanted to get these little metal beads, and I do like a screen here, and it just gives the feeling of like that's what's holding it together, right? And then there's the metal snaps. So I use these guys to kind of give like a feeling of like, in addition to being connected via like the vertical bars, I wanted it to feel like those are fastening points too. And I also wanted a pop of metal in there because I felt like without it, it kind of looked empty. So if we look at this collage, right? I just got that idea from this shot. So that's what I was trying to say, like ideas come from everywhere. You're not just gonna get all your ideas from this reference. Like this could be your main reference, but it's fantastic to pull ideas from other places. So I have this bar, I use it as a mask, so I run that through the tile sampler to say, don't populate any data here, only populate in the panels. And yeah, so that's how I generate the mask, or the fasteners. So what I do here is kind of similar to how I prepped the other areas. So I have this height map, I blur it, and that kind of gives a feeling of the fasteners like compressing into the fabric. Let me find it here in the height map. So right there you can see there's like a little bit of a carve, right? Like a little bit of a groove. And then this is like a larger scale recess point. So it's like I have the harsher edge right around the ring, and then I have a wider one to make it feel like it's pulling in. And then I'm bringing these in. So this is all coming from the metal snaps creation. I blur it a bit. And what I do is I take a blur right here, I plug it into the mask, or as a mask into the blend, and I use an add linear dodge at 1. So the reason I do that is, let me see here, let me get a good example. So if I just connect this, it's going to shoot like way up, because when you're doing add linear, it's going to give like the brightest result possible. If I just did a screen, it's not going to be nearly as impactful. So what I do with this is I then take this levels, let's see here, and I just take this white slider and I drag it way back. So then I can get in here and have like a fine level of control over the rivets themselves. All right. And then I do like a rivet tilt. And basically what this is it's a way to make the rivets all not face the same direction. So if let me see, is there a good way to show this? So if I take this out, you can, like if you watch these two, I don't know if you can see. They go from like facing the same direction, which is upward, to kind of like you can see it tilt, right? It looks like it's angled. So that's just like all these subtle layering things to make it feel more realistic and less planar and rigid. And then this is large undulation. So again, it's taking noise, isolating it per panel, and then I do an add sub. So you get areas like this where if you did have displacement on in the game, you would see this separation. So it looks like maybe here there's something behind it where they couldn't get it down all the way or whatever. Anything like that you can add is great. And then as far as the stickers go, it's pretty straightforward. I just made some stickers, placed them around. But what I did was I did the whole blur thing where I prep the area and then I do an add linear, right? So if I look at this spot, it's like super subtle in here, but in the normal map, it looks like it's on top of the cloth and independent of it, and it was like placed on top of it. So you inherit the curve from the diamond underneath, but it looks like it's raised up. So as the light rolls across it here, let me find one. Here we go. You guys see that okay? Okay. So I love that kind of stuff where it just feels like you could just like rip it off or something. I just feel like when you're doing something like that, it looks really good. And the sticker it doesn't have the same stipple as the diamond, so it feels like it's more of a plastic piece because it has like a uniform gloss response, right? It's not broken up in the normal map or in the gloss like the diamond pattern is. So the specular is pretty straightforward here. for the most part, like you could put more information into the specular, but for the way we authored stuff, I just put everything into the gloss and I use the spec to be like if it's metal or not. So as I step through here, I'm just leveraging the masks from the data that we generated all this from, and I'm identifying kind of where the metal is. Where I have dust, I do put a little bit in here, but like again, I don't even know if you'd see it. I just do it for like PBR consistency's sake, and I recommend you to do it as well. So it's just super subtle stuff to say, hey, the dust is on this and this is not fully metallic. Okay, so as far as the gloss goes, I used a curvature setup. Let me back up a bit here. So I always take this height map, run it through a normal. I use these curvature nodes a lot. So I took this, right? And I said, hey, I want this, the tiniest like raised little bit to have some interest in the gloss and in the albedo. And then as I'm stepping through the gloss, I'm calling out the metal fasteners. What's this guy? Oh, I'm giving the bar separate value for the horizontal bar. And then this vertical one, I wanted to be shinier, a tighter highlight. And then I'm saying, hey, in the recess here, when the light's rolling across, I want it to feel really deep. And then that's like the metal little fasteners there. And then here's where it comes in with the grunge, right? So again, it's the same thing. I just call this macro dust. So basically it's like a bunch of dust. It's collecting on the surface in the gloss. And then I have this edge dust here. And so what that means is like, this is like the little crevice parts. So I have like a dirt 6 and I ran it through this, I think this is coming from it's coming from the curvature. I used the levels to clamp it down. I used the dirt to break it up, and then I just flipped it around. So I'm having this dirt kind of collect in the crevices, both in the gloss and in the color. And I'm also giving specific call-outs to the stickers. So if I step up through the color here really quick, because we're about out of time, like I just call attention to the metal fasteners. I give the bar, horizontal bar, a different value and hue. Same with the vertical. And then I give the metal fasteners like really dark for the metal. The stickers have a pop. These blue ones have a pop. Then I have the dust and then the crevice dirt. So if we look at this from a value standpoint, if I desaturate everything, you can see like if you were to look at it from like a hierarchy, you're calling attention to the stickers, right? Which is what was in the reference. The reference had the first thing I saw was the stickers. Then based on the other reference I saw that we had at the time, I noticed that some of these types of setups, they had call attention to the vertical and horizontal sections. So I just decided to create some interest with that, and I gave them a brighter value. And then the second darkest part is the diamond panels themselves, and then the metal. So that's it. Does anybody have any questions?